Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Dennis MacDonald, and today's discussion is going to be based upon his book titled The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark. The link to the Amazon affiliate History Valley link will be in the description below. With that being said, welcome back to History Valley, Dennis.
Oh, thank you, Jacob. It's a pleasure.
It's my pleasure to have you here. So let's get started with our first parallel for today. Before I do, I would like you to briefly explain what mimesis criticism is, in case anybody has not seen any of your interviews on my channel from before or anywhere else.
Thank you, Jacob. I think that's a good idea. Mimesis criticism is an alternative methodology for understanding where gospel authors and other authors, too, receive their material. It's often thought that the options were eyewitness testimony or the imagination of the tradition, or to some extent the individual creativity of an author. But what often is overlooked is the importance of literary models that authors use for creating their own stories. And often this is to establish alternative social identities over against the dominant society. This is not a surprise to classicists who know that Greek education had at its core literary imitation, and their word for it is mimesis. And mimesis actually is a very simple complex concept, but it's complex in its application. And it goes something like this. An author is interested in a certain topic for a narrative, usually, and is looking for a typos, that is a model in the literature that is available to him or her that they can imitate. Then when they compose, they have a choice. They can either occult, that is to hide their imitation, to avoid charges of plagiarism, for example, or they can advertise that imitation, and they do so by means of what they would call paralleli, which is the background for our word parallel. So that when a reader is reading a new story, they recognize the similarities to a story that's a part of their culture. But the kicker is called syncresis. It's where there's a difference between the two stories to show that the hero of the new story is more courageous or wiser or more daring or more powerful than the model. So you would get this also in modern music. If a composer is interested in, let's say, composing some bluegrass music, you might listen to Doc Watson and get some ideas. And then you can use that as a typos, as the model. Then you can drop enough hints in your music so that people recognize the influence of Doc Watson on the music. And then you can see in the variations the creativity of the musician. It happens in the visual arts as well. So mimesis is really a matter of cultural reappropriation and creative transformation. But one can see this, by the way, in the way that early Christians and Jews imitated narratives in Jewish scriptures, or in the case of Judaism, in Middle Eastern mythology. But it's been invisible for the most part with scholars who are studying the New Testament, especially the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. And it's really too bad, because in many cases, if not in most, the meaning of the story is in its cultural background, its transformation. not in whether it happened or not. So people wring their hands about whether Jesus really walked on water. The authors of the Gospels know Jesus didn't walk on water. They're competing with Hermes and Poseidon and Athena, who are water walkers. And it shows that Jesus has this power as well. And in fact, he does so in order to help his disciples manage a difficult storm. So that's what mimesis is. It's literary imitation with a punch.
All right, let's get to our first slide.
Okay, there was, according to Odyssey, Book 10, and Odysseus is narrating what happened to him at Circe's island. There was a certain Elpenor, the youngest in our ranks, none too brave in battle.
And a certain young man was following him wearing a linen cloth over his nakedness.
The words for young are similar to each other. And this business of linen cloth and nakedness will be important, Jacob, because when Jesus dies on the cross, he's naked, and he is shrouded with a linen cloth by Joseph of Arimathea. It's exactly the same word in Mark as in this passage. And by the way, both young men are not brave. The young man in Mark is afraid of being arrested with Jesus, and Elpenor was none too brave in battle.
This is Odyssey.
So here, I'm sorry?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so here is another example of an imitation of the Elpenor character. So Odysseus and crew left Troy and sailed back to Achaia.
Paul and crew shipped at Troas, having left Achaia to sail back to Jerusalem.
And Troas was identified with Troy in the Roman period. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is narrating the story in the first person plural. We did this, we did that.
And the Gospel of Mark also does it, narration in first person plural.
After a sojourn, the crew and Odysseus ate a meal. The sojourn lasted for a year.
After a sojourn, the believers and Paul ate a meal.
Disaster came at night.
Disaster came at midnight.
The crew slept in Circe's darkened halls.
There were plenty of lamps in the upper room.
Elpenor fell into a sweet sleep.
Eutychus fell into a deep sleep.
And by the way, the word for sleep in both cases is identical. Let me say one more thing about the names here. Elpenor means wish to be a man. And it indicates that he's actually an anti-hero. He's not a great warrior. Eutychus means lucky. And you're going to see that at the end of Luke's story, he indeed is lucky. The narrator switches from the first person plural to the third person. And in Mark, the narrator switches.
Eutychus fell into a deep sleep.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I got confused for a second. Oh, sorry. The narrator switches to third person.
Quote, there was one Elpenor the youngest.
Quote, a certain young man named Eutychus.
Now, we saw that Mark already had picked up on this business about Elpenor, the young man, and the young man who left at the arrest. Eutychus fell from the roof. I'm sorry, Elpenor fell from the roof.
Eutychus fell from the third story.
Elpenor's soul went to Hades.
Eutychus' soul remained in him.
And in both cases, the word for soul is identical, psyche, where we get the word psyche. Associates fetched the body of Elpenor, and he was dead, but he was dead.
Associates took up the body alive. Eutychus was not raised alive until dawn.
Elpenor was not buried until dawn. So you have all of these similarities going. And if you look at the second to the last line, the parallels, that's where the syncresis appears. That is, Odysseus it cannot raise Elpenor from the dead, but Paul's power does raise Eutychus from the dead. So that's where the difference lies. And you can see why Eutychus is a good name for this young man, because he's lucky to have died when Paul was in the vicinity.
All right, let's get to the next slide.
Okay, now there came up a public beggar who was accustomed to beg through the town. He was known for a greedy belly, eating and drinking without end. Iris, all the men called him.
Now there was a prisoner named Barabbas in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection.
Now the parallels here are not going to be very clear, but Iris is a nickname. His real name is Arneas. It's a prisoner who's called Barabbas. That is nickname too, and it means son of the father. And the Jewish authorities are going to prefer this son of the father to Jesus, who is considered by the author the Son of God. So both Iris and Barabbas were violent rogues, and both bore signifying nicknames. Iris from the god Iris, Barabbas from the Aramaic for son of the father. Okay, so this, in the right-hand column, is Mark's story of the mocking of Jesus by the soldiers. And the story on the left is the mocking of Odysseus, who's in disguise by Penelope's suitors. Antinous set before him a great paunch filled with fat and blood, and Amphimenus took up 2 loaves from the basket and set them before him.
And they, the soldiers, clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him.
Okay, now this is a mocking scene, of course. And the suitors pledged him in a cup of gold and said, "Hail, Chaire, father stranger, may a happy fortune be yours in time to come."
And they began saluting him, "Hail, Chaire, King of the Jews." They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him.
This is the only instance where Chaire, or for that matter, the plural Charita, occurs in an address in Mark. Its use here and in Odyssey 18 in a remarkably similar context hardly seems accidental. Homer and Mark thus use Iris and Barabbas to intensify the guilt of their heroes' opponents. Instead of siding with the righteous, the opponents favored a boorish beggar and revolutionary. Ironically, the suitors toasted Odysseus, "Hail, father stranger," wishing him happy fortune. And of course, happy fortune would mean that he would kill the suitors. Jacob, before we go on, let me point out something that I think is really important.
Sure.
This is simply one example of how Mark, in writing his narrative of Jesus, and it informs the other Gospels as well, unfortunately uses Penelope's dismal suitors as his model for Jewish chief priests. And because Homer depicts these suitors in such a miserable way, giving them no credit, treating them as a group as a bunch of bums, by having the chief priests and basically the Jewish people play that role, has had enormous implications for anti-Semitism. And I've written on this, but I intend to write something more pointed about it later, that the choice of these models for mimesis are clever and they serve the Christian narrative well, but they don't serve the interreligious interests well. Okay, here we have a title called Sleeping Sailors. By the way, these parallels come from my first major publication on mimesis in the Gospels. So this is I haven't read these things for a decade. I mean, I've written on them otherwise, but it's fun to see them again. So here we have a story in the Odyssey about a storm at sea caused by Odysseus's unfaithful crew. And we have a similar scene in the Gospel of Mark. So you're doing well, Jacob. I'll read a bit and then you catch up to me. So they, that is Odysseus and his crew, went on board quickly and sat down upon the benches, and sitting well in order, struck the gray sea with their oars.
He boarded a boat and sat on the sea.
And you can see, Jacob, because now you're a Greek reader, how similar those words are.
Oh, yeah.
For a month, Odysseus told Aeolus his tales while floating on an island.
Jesus spoke his parables to the crowd while floating on a boat.
But when I asked him that I might depart and requested that he send me on my way, he too denied me nothing, but gave me my conveyance home.
When evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side."
Continue.
Okay. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them, since he was already in the boat.
Odysseus sailed with 12 ships. After 10 days at sea at night, he says, an enticing sleep came over me.
Other boats were with him. He himself was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion.
There you go. So you can see these parallels happening before the storm comes. Now, while Odysseus slept, his comrades questioned each other about the mysterious bag, suspecting that the hero was hiding treasure from them. Overcome by greedy paranoia, they opened the sack and unleashed a ferocious storm. Similarly, as Jesus slept, a storm arose that would demonstrate the disciples' shortcomings. They opened the bag and all the winds, animi, rushed out, and swiftly the storm wind seized them and bore them weeping out to sea.
A great gale of wind, animo, arose, and waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped.
Mark describes the storm with Homeric nautical vocabulary. A great gale of wind, lilops megale anemu, arose, and waves kumata beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. The New Testament uses the word lilops, gale of the sea, only here and in its Lucan parallel. And in the Septuagint, it relates to the sea only twice, never in a narrative. But in the Odyssey, lilops occurs 6 times, always about the sea and always in narratives, as here in Mark. So I'm pretty proud of these parallels. Now, let me say, Jacob, how others have criticized this work. They say that the story here in Mark is not generated by mimesis of the Odyssey, but mimesis of the book of Jonah, because Jonah similarly is asleep, has to be waked, there's a gale, and so on. And my answer to them is, they're right. They're right. But to say that the author of the Gospel of Mark is indebted to Jonah does not mean he's not indebted to another model. And if you compare them carefully, you'll see that there are certain motifs in this story that don't appear in Jonah. So where is he getting them? I mean, he may not get them from the Odyssey, but it's amazing that you have those correlations so well. Do you have another one for us?
Yeah, I just pulled it up, actually.
Okay. While you're pulling it up, let me say why New Testament scholars, as a rule, are reluctant to see parallels like this. And this is a good example. Often they look for antecedents in Jewish scriptures, which is fair enough. And if they can find them, then they don't need to have a model from the Greco-Roman world. But there's another more insidious problem, I think. That is, when one compares texts, too often one is looking for consistent verbal similarities between the two and not artistic similarities between the two. That is, that narratives often are generated by having one narrative feeding the next, and then having these exchanges. So I think that New Testament scholars have been too unimaginative about understanding the origins of these stories in the Greek world.
So in this slide, you talk about Odyssey 10:1-69 to Mark 4:35-41.
We've already done this one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this is the same one.
It looks like I accidentally put it in separate slides there. Well, I don't believe we did this one. Odyssey 10, 345-25, and 330-33 to Mark 5:6-8.
This is the Gerasene demoniac. Yeah, we've done this one before, but I think it's one of the most spectacular ones. Actually, is there a slide before that one that would help set it up? This is page 61.
I don't think I do.
Yeah. Could we pick up another story? Do you have another one for us?
Yeah, I got this one here.
Oh, okay. This is the same story. And this, will you have a follow-up slide with this then? Page 67?
I have 2 more slides after this.
Oh, okay, good. All right, here we go. Odysseus and crew sailed to Iliad, and Circe turned his soldiers into swine.
Jesus and disciples sailed to the region of the Gerasenes.
When Odysseus drew his sword against her, the ogre ran to him, knelt, called him by name, and begged for mercy.
When Jesus ordered the demon to depart, the demoniac ran to him, knelt, called him by name, and begged for mercy.
Now, one of the things that is missing in these parallels that I would have emphasized later is that let's just go on with this. This is just the Polyphemus, the Cyclops lives in a cave, and the demoniac is a cave dweller. He lives among the caves. Okay, next slide. I and the rest of my trusty crew embark with speed on the swift ships, and they went aboard straightway and sat down upon the benches, and sitting in order smote the great sea. He got into the boat on the sea. He said, let's go to the other side, and so on. I think we're going to be better off skipping this page until the bottom of the page. It's hard for me to see where we are.
Let me see if I can. I'll pull up the PowerPoint version so I can zoom in, because that's one thing I don't like about StreamYard is it doesn't let you zoom in.
Okay.
Like it does in PowerPoint. So let me switch to share screen to fix this problem. Hold on a second. Whoops. All right. Is that better?
Well, it's clearer. That's right. The issue is where we are in our story. Well, I guess we can. I bade the rest of my comrades to embark with speed on the swift ships. So they went on board straightway and sat down upon the benches, and sitting well in order, smote the grey sea with their oars.
He got into a boat on the sea and sat there. He said to them, "Let us go to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him into the boat just as he was.
And we sailed on, grieved at heart, and came to the land of the Cyclopes.
Other boats were with him. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes.
Yeah, we have done this before, I think. And we benched the ships, we lowered all the sails, and ourselves disembarked.
And when he had stepped out of the boat.
Yeah, taken in isolation, these similarities require no literary dependence whatsoever. Oops, you scrolled beyond me. Insofar as they instantiate a stock pattern in sailing stories, their significance lies in a common placement just before encounters with cavemen. So let me just read this paragraph and see if that catches us up. Homer depicts the Cyclopes as barbaric shepherds in a primitive fantasy land where wild goats innumerable run free. They are insolent and lawless, know nothing of husbandry, commerce, or shipbuilding, dwell on the peaks of the mountains in hollow caves, and not only flaunt the conventions of ancient hospitality, but enjoy eating strangers along with their cheese and mutton chops. Polyphemus himself was a giant clothed in tremendous strength, a savage man that knew nothing of rights or law, who could lift a stone that no 22 wagons, rugged and four-wheeled, could budge off the ground. He, like the rest of his tribe, lived in a huge cave and was not above cannibalism. Why don't you begin reading there, Jacob?
Lurking up, he lunged out with his hands toward my men, and snatching two at once, rapping them on the ground, he knocked them dead like pups. Their brains gushed out all over, soaked the floor. Let me just scroll down. And ripping them limb from limb to fix his meal, he bolted them down like a mountain lion. He left no scrap, devoured entrails, flesh and bones, marrow and all.
Can you scroll a little further?
I think that's it, actually.
Okay. Well, the end of the story is that Odysseus blinds Polyphemus and steals his sheep. Jesus, however, heals the demoniac and returns him to his right mind.
And this is the final slide. Oh wait, this is actually.
This is a continuation, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, there's an exchange of names. Nobody is my name. Legion is my name. Do you have another slide, or is that it?
This is it.
Okay. Let's not look at the slides. Let's talk to each other for just a minute.
Sure.
I'm 77 years old, almost 78. My intellectual energies are not what they used to be, and I'm doing my best to keep my health up. No, but I could do better, I must say. I'm so frustrated that mimesis criticism has made only modest headway into the Guild of New Testament Scholarship. And if you look at the programs of the Society for New Testament Studies or the Society of Biblical Literature, you'll find really nothing on imitation of classical Greek poetry. It is so frustrating to me. So I want to talk about two projects, if I might, Jacob, where I'm trying to make things more accessible and less academic. The first one is called Synoptic Epistles and Homeric Epics. And it's really quite a fanciful interpretation of the gospel authors arguing with themselves. So the author of the Q document is arguing with Mark. Mark is arguing with the author of the Q document and with Matthew. Luke has his problems with both of them. And it's been so much fun to write. And it's in the tradition of pseudonymous literature that the Greeks wrote themselves in argumentation. And it's been so much fun to write. There is no scholarly jargon. There are no chapter verse numbers that interrupt the narrative. There are no charts and parallel columns. They're written as though they're scholarly articles of one author to another. And it's been so much fun. Now, the footnotes are lavish in hundreds of footnotes, but of chapter verse numbers, not of other interpretations. And this is a way of writing something that's more imaginative, coherent, and far-reaching. It deals with all the Gospels, including the Q document, and I'm really very proud of it. and I expect it to be done by the end of the year. In fact, I have a penultimate draft of it ready to go right now with an index. But my daughter, who's a poet, an author in her own right, and also a copy editor, and I are collaborating on a dad and daughter interview, and she's not an expert in biblical scholarship at all. So she asks me questions about classical Greek poetry, Homer, mimesis, the Gospels, and we take examples such as you and I have been talking about in this series of podcasts. And she's going to transcribe them and publish them as this father-daughter discourse. And I'm not allowed to have a single text in front of me. So we're not going to scroll through texts as we've done. I have to do it all by memory. So it's something like this. Hey, Dad, why don't you tell me about the story of Jesus and the storm? So by memory, I have to tell that story, but I also have to tell the story of Aeolus, remind myself and her of what the parallels are and what syncresis is at stake for the author of the Gospel of Mark in rewriting this story. And the goal is to make it available to first-year high school students who are interested in narrative, who are capable of reading on their own. And often that's a great time to learn to read and to have fun. And I'm hoping that actually it makes itself into some Sunday schools. I doubt if it will. But it's been a lot of fun to try to do an end run around my own discipline and get some attention in the public. And that's one reason I agree to podcasts like yours. I'm really eager to have a legacy of the thrill of understanding how these authors are working, what their intentions are, in what their literary models are. And I just hope that people who read these books will read these texts for themselves and enjoy them as much as I do.
We have a super chat. B-Bear, thank you for your super chat. What do you think of the Cave of the Nymphs in Odyssey, Book 13? Porphyry Tribe wrote on it in relation to Neoplatonism and transmigration of souls.
B-Bear, that is a very smart question. And it's not only about Odyssey 13. You're quite right that Porphyry wrote his own allegorical interpretation of it in terms of the transmigration of souls. My caution would be that I don't think Homer would have had that in mind at all. Think of it this way. Odysseus left his family, left his estate, left his slaves, and for 10 years fought in Troy and he had no quarrel with the Trojans. So then he comes back. It takes him 10 years to get back. He's at one point deprived of everything, including his clothing. He's absolutely destitute. And his family now has been for years attacked by Penelope's suitors, and they're running out of resources. So Homer is interested in paying Odysseus back by having these wealthy Phaeacians, who is the tribe that's closest to the gods, as Homer says. And they laden his ship with treasure, and by stacking it in the cave away from attention, he's able then to after he's slaying the suitors, he's able to fetch it and reward his faithful slaves and establish himself again in his kingdom. So I think it has a pretty clear narrative function. in terms of Homer. So I think the transmigration of the souls that Porphyry is advocating not only is a stretch on the story, but Homer would not have anything to do with transmigration of the souls. So I'd be interested in if Porphyry had written anything on the Nicaea, the visit of Odysseus to the netherworld, because there it would be very handy if you had some kind of a transmigration of the souls. Otherwise, the souls would be punished like Tantalus forever. But that's a very smart and learned question. I appreciate it.
Do you think that the early Christians were already looking to connect the Homeric narratives in the sense via mimesis prior to the composition of the Gospels, or do you think it only started happening when the Gospel of Mark was being composed? And can you talk about Q a little bit in relation to all that?
The author of Q already is imitating Homer, but not imitating it strategically. That is, there seems not to be any syncresis to show that Jesus is better than Odysseus or Telemachus. Actually, the author is more interested in Telemachus and in Odysseus' slaves than he is in Odysseus himself. And the point is that you have a wonderful narrative of the empowerment of a young man who is now seeking empowerment from the gods to reclaim his father's kingdom. And the parallels with the Odyssey, I think, are quite striking. So, yes, before the Gospels, you have imitation, but it's occulted imitation. It's to take a story from Homer and apply it to Jesus, in this case, the Telemachus narrative, and to show that Jesus has an empowerment that's similar to Odysseus, to Telemachus, but he's not trying to be better than Telemachus. But it's important to realize that other Jews, independent of the gospel authors in the first century, but even earlier, are already imitating Homer. We find this in the book of Judith, where there's an imitation of the Iliad. We find it in Tobit, that has a remarkable parallel to the Odyssey, actually a number of parallels to the Odyssey. The Testament of Abraham has an absolutely magnificent mimesis of the Odyssey. The washing of Odysseus's feet by Euryclea. So this is a game that these authors are playing. In the case of the Testament of Abraham, it's humorous. It really is fun, and the reader is expected to see the parallels and to get a giggle out of it all. So this is, of course, pagans are imitating Homer as well. One thinks of Virgil in the Aeneid, well before the writing of the Gospels, is saturated with Homeric imitation. And of course, Lucian, writing around 180, I suppose, has whole discourses or narratives that are imitations of the Homeric epics. So it's in the air. Hegel once said that Homer is the oxygen that Greeks breathe. So to have the New Testament authors imitating Homer doesn't make them unique. It makes them representative of the extent of the saturation of Greek culture with poetry.
Beaver says, how great is Luciano's Samosata in response to Homer?
Luciano, I think Mr. Bear is an Italian, if I'm not mistaken. That's the Luciano is Lucian. Lucian's attitude toward Homer is remarkably playful. And in his ironically named story called The True Story, he begins by saying, I'm tired of all these people who are making headway in literature by telling lies. And the source of all those lies is Homer. He tells stories about one-eyed monsters, about cannibals, about drugs that change people into beasts. And I'm tired of it all. So I've decided I'm going to do the same thing. The difference is I'm going to tell you that I'm lying. And then when he goes into The True Story, I mean, it's really an amazing text. You need to read it, Mr. Bear. You would enjoy it. Actually, Homer and Odysseus play roles inside the narrative itself. So you know that it's an advertised mimesis. And it's one lie after another. So in this case, he's really panning the Homeric epics. And he has, to some extent, Socrates to thank for it. Socrates also appears in The True Story and is cynical about such mythologies. So by comparison to Homer, of course, Socrates is an intellectual and an empiricist, more of a scientist. Although Aristotle is going to be a better scientist than Plato ever was, or Socrates. But Lucian is panning Homer a lot, all the time, but also is cleverly paying homage to him because it is the Homeric epics you imitate, not others.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dennis.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Jacob.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.